Hello, and let me introduce Ed Kenyak to you. Ed is on the band school band musicianship course teaching the saxophone. So this is a good moment, I think, Ed, for us to have a chat.
And nice to meet you in person for the first time. We've had a lot of discussions over the airways, and
We have, yes.
it's nice to work with you.
Yes, this is post-lockdown, folks, and we're able to get together and have a proper conversation. So we're just going to talk about, we're going to talk about things from the perspective of somebody who might want to join the course. Let's say there's somebody with little background in jazz, popular music, big bands, and improvisation, and they want to learn how to do it, how to make a transition from the world of classical, perhaps, or the world of
Woodwind bands, or
that's right, wind bands, concert bands, whatever. So that's the kind of students we're looking for. And so, first of all, do you think it's a big transition for anyone to make from that world to this world?
I don't think so. I mean, I've been doing it all my life practically, but it's just going to be different. All right, so
Yeah.
the discipline is slightly different, and the approach is going to be challenging to somebody who's only ever read music in their life. If you've played stuff by ear before, then it's going to be easier because you're going to pick up on some of the key concepts of improvisation,
Yes.
and it's doing everything that you would do in a classical orchestra or a wind band or a brass band, but with the freedom of using your own technique with ear training to develop and improve as a musician.
So there's a big emphasis on ear, the
Absolutely.
use of the ear, and improvisation, which to a lot of players who are interested in the course, they will have little or no background in improvising, so it might seem a bit scary to them to have
That's
to.
the scary side. But
Is it scary though?
but
Should
if
it be
you-
scary?
But if you've actually picked up a tune without the music and just
Yeah.
tried to play that, then that's all you're doing. You're just developing that side
Sure.
of your musicality, and so
Sure.
it doesn't have to be entirely scary. It's just going to be a different way of approaching music,
Yeah.
and a fun way. It's the discipline is still there, but you've kind of got that leeway to express yourself more.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think you'll agree there's a lot of different approaches to improvising.
Absolutely.
You know, and in fact, it's all these different approaches brought together to produce a solo. And I'd be interested to find out more about what approach you might take, or what you would recommend to beginners of improvisation. How would you approach that?
I think the first step I would take would be just to try to make up a melody around the basic tune. All right. So if
yeah.
you play the tune and then embellish the tune, because that's possibly an easier prospect than creating something completely new.
Mm-hmm.
So even today when I'm taking a solo, I will start with the tune, and maybe I might just add a few extra notes to
Yes.
to the first chorus of the
Yeah.
solo.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah, I mean that's an approach I'm familiar with too. It's certainly a good way to get into it. So if you start with the melody and begin to deviate
Yeah.
a little bit, yeah, and so that kind of approach would be very pre-bop, kind of bop approach, wouldn't it?
Pre-bop, yeah, I
Pre-bop.
guess so, yeah.
I mean that's a traditional approach, isn't it? Going way back.
Yeah.
That's what the jazzers did. They took the melody and they twisted it.
Don't go too far away, and then you can always hear the melody within the solo.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. So that's what you'd be doing with them. You'd be
That's the
encouraging that.
that's the first step,
Uh-huh.
okay? And then the next step is start to begin to be musical with the scales that are based on
Yeah.
the tune, all right?
Right,
So
yeah.
every tune you'll ever hear is going to have chords behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it starts to become a bit strange for people that haven't improvised before. It's a different kind of approach. It's
Yeah,
a different concept.
Do you know, I wonder if in the world of brass band and concert bands, wind bands and classical orchestras, they're not very familiar with chord symbols, are they? It's not their bag.
It's not what you see. You don't see it.
You don't see them.
And you don't have to respond to it within the context of a concert.
That's also true. Yeah.
Right? You will get a written solo, which is either superbly read or learnt to the point of absolute brilliance, so that you can perform it live. Right?
Yeah.
Now in jazz, you still get those solos. You'll get an ad-lib section, which may have chords above it, and quite a lot of the time, the composer will write a solo, right? And you sit down, and I've played a few of these solos, and I've been made to play them note for note.
Yeah.
But I love doing it when I just get the freedom to just play in my natural playing style.
Yeah.
And that is something that you won't get in a pre-written orchestrated solo in a different context. And then it's understanding the chord symbols as well as the melody to create something of your own.
Yeah. All right, so Ed, we're talking about chord symbols, and so you have one of these new students joining us, and they're looking at chord symbols, and what are they supposed to take from that, from these chord symbols?
First of all, the chords are just outlines of the scales, so they give you an idea of what notes you're allowed to play, within the context of a given tune. It's not the first thing I would do, but
No,
certainly.
I was going to ask you, would you expect a student to be able to take a chord symbol and know immediately what notes make up the chord symbol?
Not initially.
Not initially, no.
But certainly, from a basic perspective, when you're playing arpeggios on a melody instrument, you kind of get an idea of chords for the first time. But in this instance, you might only understand root, third, and fifth. Right? Okay. So when we get into the jazz world, where we begin with root, third, fifth, and seventh, and that gives us an idea of the scale. Because if it's a dominant seventh, we have a particular scale called the Mixolydian scale, which is a major scale with a flat seventh.
Yeah.
Now that a little bit more information, but if it's a major seventh scale, we're talking about the straight major scale, okay? Which everybody hopefully on this course will know, the major scale. So when you start to extend these notes, the ninth is sounds complicated, but it's not really complicated. All it is a second, or the second note of a scale up the octave.
Sure.
And then 11th, the fourth note of the scale up the octave. And then we got the final pièce de résistance, the 13th.
Oh, yes,
and
the 13th.
And at this point, we've got the last note in the scale.
Yeah.
Okay, we have the 6th degree of the scale. So all you're doing is you're playing a scale, and the more information within the description of the chord, whether it's a 13th or an 11th or dominant 13th, that gives you an idea of what notes you can play.
Right.
Okay, so it's understanding the one, first of all. And from the one, we can work out roughly how to describe the chord. Right?
So at that point, then, you don't have to be thinking about a scale. You just simply take all your information from the chord symbol.
We can just do that simply,
way.
first of all. Absolutely.
Okay.
There's times when the information within the scale is within the chord is so specific that we do need to understand most of the notes in the scale.
Right. And speaking of scales, you mentioned the Mixolydian scale there, which is a good scale to learn. But how many scales do you think the sorts of students we might get? What sort of, how many scales should they learn? I mean, you don't want to bombard them with scales, I presume, or
absolutely
how
not.
many scales though? Which ones do you think are the best ones for them to learn? Would you say?
When I'm teaching normal scales, if you like, or classical scales, I don't like to teach people them note for note. I like to teach them the concept behind each scale. and then hopefully when you
Okay.
come to a different note name, you
Mhm.
can still play that same scale
Right.
because you know the relationship of the scale as opposed to the notes within that one scale.
Uh-huh. Yes, yes, that's
And
right.
I've
Yes.
come across loads of scale books over time, and they're a good
Right.
way of people making money because they teach you the scales, and
Yeah.
if you're happy to pay to
Yes.
learn the
Yes.
scales one by one,
Yeah.
that's a great way to learn scales. But
Yeah.
actually, to understand the concept of a scale
Yeah.
is probably the best
My
way.
my experience is similar to yours. That you know, the graded exams, theory exams, seem to drag out the information, where actually you could be given it in a very simple lesson.
Yeah,
Um, so, I mean, in my view, you might agree that the core of it all is the circle of fifths. If you can understand the circle of fifths, which is all the keys of the major scale, and if you understand how every chord and every type of scale has a spelling that relates to the major
yeah,
scale,
yeah.
that's the concept I think
Brilliant.
that Ed's talking about. Once you've got that, you can apply that to any root note, any key note, you've got it all. So you're not just learning individual keys and the notes that are in them.
Yeah.
So that's a way to put it all together. By the way, the theory side of things, we won't be going into too heavily during the course dates because there isn't the time. We'll be more focused on practical, but there will be a theoretical component on the site eventually. By the time of the course, it'll all be there.
Fantastic. So yeah, absolutely. As you said, just to reiterate, it's the relationship behind the scales that we want to teach, not just random scales out of context.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Presumably, I mean, we have a repertoire for the first term, and we're still working on the second term and third terms, exactly what those pieces are going to be. But obviously, it's going to be progressive. But in the first term, I think it's fair to say we've chosen songs that the chord progressions aren't too challenging.
Yep.
Because this is the big issue, isn't it? It's
Just
dealing with chord changes.
I think one of the interesting issues is some people are going to take to it rather quite simply, and others are going to struggle maybe a little bit more, or it might take them a little bit more time to get used to doing something slightly different from where they're coming from. So we're going to try to cater for those differences, I think, and that's going to be a challenge for us. But it'll be fun, I think.
Yeah. But as you know, we're depending on the level of interest and exactly who the students are, we have the potential to have a class in the morning and a separate class in the afternoon aimed at two levels of player. So beginner and also more like intermediate, perhaps. So they can be approached differently, can't they?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to spin this around to something else now. I mean, we could go on about that because it's, you know, it goes in depth, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this from the perspective of saxophone players who don't have the experience in jazz and popular music and want to make that transition. So, what do they need in terms of what are the ideal resources for them to have? The saxophone, the mouthpiece, the reed, and anything else you care to mention? What do they need, do you think?
Anything you kind of do and you want to do well, you've just got to make sure that you've got the right equipment and a facility to play the whole range of the instrument from top to bottom fairly comfortably, if not very comfortably. And when you spend more money on an instrument, hopefully you're getting a little bit more ease with the extreme highs and lows of that instrument and how you get around it.
But would there be a particular model of saxophone or a particular kind of mouthpiece that would lend itself to the jazz tone? And
I think with saxophone, it's a misconception that you need to spend a lot of money on a good saxophone to play very well. You just need a solid horn that does play well anyway, a few £100 maybe.
Right.
And then the mouthpiece is going to be a little bit more.
Right.
That's going to be what gives you your individuality and the control over the saxophone.
So is the mouthpiece more important than the rest of it then?
I think so.
Okay.
And there's probably good arguments in my favour to express that. I have played on. We weren't particularly well off when I was growing up learning the saxophone, and the biggest difference to my playing in the early days when I moved from a basic Yamaha 4C, which is the standard starter mouthpiece,
Right.
was moving on to a Selmer. Now the Selmer was a copy of the vintage Selmers that we get. It wasn't a vintage Selmer; it was just a nice modern remake. And this thing just gave me control of my sound, and my intonation was a little bit better, a little bit stronger than it had been before. And that's where you can kind of start to learn the difference. A classical mouthpiece is always it's not gonna lend itself to you doing some of the nuances that you're expected to do in a big band.
Are these nuances that you could demonstrate in this video later on, perhaps, or is it too subtle?
I will demonstrate some techniques
Okay,
at some
so
point.
you've got that to look forward to later on in this video. Okay, Ed, that's good. What about the embouchure? Because that's obviously a critical part of playing, isn't it? I mean, is there a difference in the embouchure between classical, say, and jazz?
Yes. Again, you're going to have to demonstrate lots of different styles, including classical styles in the jazz idiom. But if you're coming from the classical world, you'll probably have a more double kind of embouchure, which opens you up for clarinet playing a little bit more, and that technique is not going to help you too much. You do need a little bit more of a relaxed technique for playing jazz, because you're bending notes in a certain way. You are doing lots of falls, and you do need a strong tone, so you do need to have that strong bridge of a mouthpiece, of a mouth, when you're playing in certain ways. But
so you mentioned a fall there. So for anyone who doesn't know, they might just think you mean tripping up or something. But so just explain what a fall is then, because it's a bit of a jazz term, isn't it? You don't get that in classical saxophone.
Not really, no. So a fall is when you just start at a note, let's say an F, and you just run down the sax.
Glissando type.
Glissando, but at the same time, you're dropping your lip as well. So literally you're getting some of the in between notes on the sax, and it does sound like a boom. It's like a It sounds like a fall.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we could talk about some of these other terms. Are there any you could think of now that would be worth mentioning out of interest?
Growl.
A growl.
What's a growl? A growl is when you play a note and you sing that very same note at the same time.
All right.
And when you sing the same note as you're playing, it comes out as a growling. It comes out as though you're grating your throat, but you're not. You're actually just singing a note, and you're getting that little dissonance, and it creating a grind of a sound. So it's like a distortion effect on a guitar, I would say. That's what we call a growl on the saxophone.
I think maybe some of these techniques you're describing now, we'll put this in another video.
Yeah.
So there might be another video yet of some of these things Ed showing you them. Can you think of any others that we might refer to later on? The growl, we've got the fall, the growl.
And also we can, wonderful Dougal that's playing this, our trombone tutor.
Doug is our trombone tutor. Look out for him. He'll be on his way.
And we can do multiphonics, so we can actually sing a note above the note you're playing.
Oh yeah.
And that also comes out, the actual note that you're playing comes out of a growl, but then you've got a double note happening, and it's a nice effect. And these are just interesting ways of playing. You do get them in 20th century compositions, so they're not exclusive to jazz, but but they're wonderful techniques and fun to do.
Cool. All right. Well, more on that later. Like I say, these questions to you are a little bit random. Ed, there's no there's no particular order to this, but let's talk about big bands for a moment. That type of format, which is obviously a part of the course, and also the combo format.
Yeah.
Let's not assume that everybody knows what those two formats comprise in the way of players. So could you just talk about those two formats as you understand them, in terms of the lineup, and particularly with regard to saxophones?
So I've played most of my life in small band and combo formats.
Yeah.
So the small band in a jazz format would be generally a quartet featuring piano, bass, and drums, and someone like myself at the front leading the band. And
I notice you didn't mention guitar there, folks. He's leaving us out there. I'm a guitar teacher.
well, you'd be leading the trio.
Oh, okay.
So that.
Oh, right. I see.
And then we open it up to 5-piece band, which might include a guitar or it might include a trumpet, and then the basic jazz combo that we can get is probably a septet, isn't it?
Septet, yes.
Okay, and that would be 3 horns.
Yeah.
That would be a trumpet, sax, and trombone. Okay, and then we have guitar.
Thank you.
Doing lots of nice colours and shapes, and heading up the harmony as well.
Yeah.
Then we've got the keys or the piano. Then we've got the bass, and then finally, but not least, the drums. And it's really a strong rhythm section that it's totally dependent on the whole piece. You know, we need a very strong,
absolutely,
guys like Andy playing guitar, and that is what makes a band. Really.
I often say that the rhythm section, whether it's a combo or a big band, it's like the gate post that has to be strong. Doesn't matter how strong the gate is. If the gate post isn't strong enough, it's going to fall. It's going to fail.
Gate post, engine room. You've probably heard.
Engine room, yeah.
And that's what we rely on.
So, in regard to the big band, then obviously there's a saxophone section. Can you tell us about the saxophone section? Introduce it to those that might not know anything about it.
So your basic big band setup comprises of 5 saxophones, 2 tenors, 2 altos, and a baritone sax, which is an octave below the altos. Okay. Generally speaking, we have in terms of Glenn Miller, you'll get some basic doubling between the first alto and the first tenor, for example, and then you'll get doubling between the second alto and the second tenor on basic harmony kind of.
Right. So they're not always playing a unique part.
Not always. Certainly not in the older sort of versions of tunes that we love and hear.
Yeah.
As time moved by, when we got into, let's say, the bebop era or the Count Basie. Okay, let's talk about Count Basie first of all. These harmonies became more intricate, got more into, within the section, more into 7th harmony, and sometimes extending beyond the 7th to the
5-part harmony.
5-part harmony, indeed. And the biggest, most fun part to kind of express a sax section is when all the saxophones are playing a Charlie Parker style solo in a concerted kind of multi-solo between five players doing the same rhythmic idea.
That's what you mean by concerted, right?
Concerted, yeah, indeed. But everybody's kind of playing a harmonised jazz solo together, and we call that.
You might get in a choir. You know, choirs that they're all singing the same thing, but or might be singing the same thing, but harmonising.
Harmonised, and we call that a soli.
Soli, yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's a big feature of big bands, isn't it? Solis. So if you're a saxophone player, you'll be learning to play solis.
And a great soli, an example of a great soli is, if you listen to the Count Basie Big Band 70s video online, you will hear a tune called "In a Mellow Tone," and I still have nightmares learning that that sax soli from my Salford days. So yes, and that's one of the biggest features. So really get into, and that's what we're going to hopefully try and tap into on this course and
Sure.
get people learning these things
Yeah.
and hopefully enjoying playing them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. Let's see what else I've got to ask you. Um, what's this? I just wondered. I've written this down here because I'm interested to know, and you might be interested to know as well. How has jazz saxophone evolved over the last 100 years? Do you think? Could you sum it up in a sentence or two?
Okay, well,
Has it changed or not?
100 years ago, arguably there wasn't any jazz saxophone.
If there was any, it'd be
If it
New Orleans,
it
right?
would be New Orleans or trad.
Mm-hmm.
New Orleans is obviously to me the birth of jazz, and when we were listening to these things, you would get a basic theme, and the theme would be improvised in a very simplistic embellishment of the melody, and very simplistic outline of the chords between the instruments. You get various instruments soloing within the context of the whole piece, and
Collective improvisation. That's
and
what
certainly
we call it.
collective improvisation as well.
Yeah. You know, thinking back to those bands, not that I'm an expert on that particular genre, but I can't recollect ever seeing a saxophone in that. It was more clarinet, wasn't it?
More clarinet. Okay. And of course the saxophone wasn't really given any status until about 1936. Okay.
Right.
When a guy called Coleman Hawkins came along, and people didn't just recognise the fact that it was a saxophone. The key thing was they recognised who was playing the saxophone, and that's where for me jazz begins, because it's one thing to be able to play an instrument; it's another thing for people to know who it is playing that individual instrument.
Yeah, I think that certainly applies to guitar as well. Guitar soloists. It's about achieving your own voice, a unique voice, and not sounding like everybody else.
So moving from there, we have the fantastic Duke Ellington Band, and when he wrote for his musicians, he didn't write for the individual instruments. He wrote for the musicians that he'd worked with and knew how to bring out the best in their playing and really highlight what was going on. An idea that was later copied by Charlie Mingus and various other artists.
Right.
And until we come to the point of the funk bands of the 80s,
Funk bands,
70s and 80s, where you've got people like Bob Mincer, great educator, wonderful musician, taking all the ideas that we've had from Parker and so forth, and just modernising them in such a way, and blending that 18-piece combo, the big band, into something that can compete in a more contemporary world, that's the secret to keeping this music alive. He's trying to blend it with, or fuse it with, what's going on now in different musical genres. And
do you think, in terms of its evolution, do you think it's more technically demanding now? Are there more virtuosos? I'm just thinking of other instruments where, when they've been introduced, like the bass guitar is a good example. Not the double bass, I might add, the bass guitar. But, it has enjoyed its own evolution from being played quite simplistically to becoming a virtual instrument. And now you get, bass soloists in the jazz world, if not in other genres, who are incredible soloists, and they're really shredding on the bass guitar. And that's part of its evolution, and I'm sure that happens with every instrument. I just wonder,
certainly does.
Is there more virtuoso playing associated with jazz saxophone now than in the earlier days, do you think?
I think I would have to say, of course,
right, okay.
because people are taking what these pioneers did, your John Coltrane's, your Charlie Parker's, and every so often they're moving it a step beyond. Harmonically, the harmonies are, the harmonic world changed when Giant Steps came along, which is the flagship album of John Coltrane. And then people developed that harmonic idea and pushed it into the 80s. You had the fantastic Michael Brecker came along, and his style was crafted from John Coltrane, but you may not think it when you first hear the two different sounds, but the sound of Brecker is modern, and I was lucky enough to see him once or twice before he passed away. But and people are still, I think, people are pushing the Brecker thing now beyond beyond Brecker, which I think is it is incredible, and I'm still waiting for the next Brecker, I think.
So there you're talking about individual players, but taking it back to the big band again in the saxophone section, I'm sure you'll agree that it's more about team playing.
Absolutely.
And everybody has a critical role.
Yeah.
Can you sort of can you clear up exactly what each individual saxophone player's role is within the five-piece? Each of them does have its own role, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe start with the leader.
So the lead alto, for example, will more often than not perhaps get a feature, be playing the main melody, and the spotlight will be on this guy. And if there's a section where the first and second alto are playing together, the second alto might be playing an intricate second line, right? The second tenor will be playing an intricate third line, which may be alongside the second alto.
And that must be quite tough to play a line that's not the melody of the tune.
That's not the melody.
And maybe when it's played on its own, it might seem a bit odd.
Doesn't sound.
If you're practicing at home,
yeah,
without anything else, and you're playing that line, it might seem a bit odd.
So very difficult job to play the second alto or second tenor, because you aren't playing a natural melody line, and it takes time to get used to that idea. And quite often you've got doubled notes that don't feel natural, but they work within the harmony. So what we'd hopefully be doing is sharing the job of first and second on both tenor and alto, because hopefully then people get a chance to play both sides of the coin and get used to developing both techniques.
Does the alto one, the leader who's alto one, does he have to play a little bit louder than everyone else so that his line is heard above? I mean, you wouldn't want a tenor two dominating the sound.
Absolutely. So
it's all about blending in the right way.
The soloist or the featured artist must be accompanied in a certain way, or play that little bit louder just to clarify that they're being featured.
So who would get the solos, generally speaking?
In saxophone section, you've tenor one, alto one.
Yeah.
Okay. Unless, but this can change. A composition doesn't have to be performed the same way every time. All right. So you can get strong players who decide they don't want to improvise. All right, they can read the music, they can swing, they can feel the music, but they're not. So sometimes you might get a shared solo section, so it might be split between the first and the second.
I think that's maybe quite important to point out to some people that you don't all have to be improvising from the get-go.
Yeah.
If you're in the big band format, because as you said, alto one and tenor one tend to do most of the improvised solos.
Yeah.
So the other guys, they can just be part of the team and reading the music that's in front of them.
Yep.
But you mentioned a critical word there, which is swing. People from a classical background might not really understand that.
I think in this day and age, it's not hard to listen and find things that. And the idea of swing is different to everybody. I think everybody's got their own individual swing, individual tone, individual concept of jazz. But when I think swing, I think Stan Getz I think I think Count Basie, real hard swing,
Right.
and with that you do want to dance, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not too sticky.
Right.
It's not too lumpy, you know.
These are technical terms, folks. Sticky and lumpy. Nothing to do with food now. It's jazz.
When it gets too sort of more commercial, it can become a bit cheesy. All right, so
Right.
so we don't want it to be too show worthy. That's a different genre. We want it to just feel nice and just be very musical and cool without it being over-egged, if you like. So there's a fine line between swing and various interpretations that aren't swing. And,
There's different levels of swing.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think Louis Armstrong was right when he said it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing? Does that mean that all jazz is swing?
Unfortunately, yeah, he's quite right. It don't mean a thing if it don't have that swing. So,
But what about you know the way sometimes jazz blends with other styles like Latin?
Yeah.
So obviously you get Latin jazz, which the course would hope to cover as well.
Yeah.
So that's clearly not swing, is it? That's a straight eights type of thing.
Straight A. So, and we can happily do those styles, and
Yeah.
it lends itself to.
Or funk even, you know.
We can do a funk thing, and hopefully just enjoy the different genres. And we've got more now. We used to, when I was on a jazz gig back in the 90s. What did we used to do? We used to have one Latin, one's mainstream swing, one fast swing,
Yeah.
one ballad.
Right.
What did we have? What else? And that was it.
And then pass the hat round.
Yeah. And nowadays, you have to do a hip hop groove. Yeah. You have to do, you have to do all the modern styles. All right. And it's great. But the thing is, I think the main thing is, with this course, we don't want to just play jazz tunes in a jazz way. We want to maybe open up the different, more contemporary styles. And
yeah, I think that's important. It's not just jazz. It is about jazz and popular music generally. And we should try to also include a contemporary edge where we can.
So this is where you guys have to help us out, because
we being the rhythm section.
You guys have to help us out always.
Yes,
but people that come onto the course or are interested in the course might decide that they want to play one particular tune, and it might not necessarily be a jazz tune. It might be the classic tune by Radiohead, for example, "Creep."
Yeah.
When I heard that, I've heard 100 different versions of that now, and not necessarily the Radiohead version of it.
No.
There's many jazz versions of this very tune.
Well,
And
there might be a place on the survey. If you go to the band school website, bandschool.com, spelled with a K, there's a survey on there. I think there might be a question which invites you to express your view about what you would want to do on the course. So that could include.
That would be great, yeah.
Maybe different stylistic influences, or maybe even a particular tune. We'll wrap things up in a minute or two, Ed. We've just given a little bit of a taster as to what we might be, covering. Jazz, like any style, the only way you get good at playing it and improvising it, I think you'll agree, is to listen to lots of it. You have to listen to it, and you have to copy it.
Yeah.
What players do you think, if you had to put together a list of top 10, let's say, of jazz saxophonists?
Wow, yeah.
Who would you include in that? Who would be your number one?
Wow, that's
No surprises, maybe.
that's a great question, a massively great question. My number one, there is a surprise. There will be a surprise. There's a guy called Ralph Moore, who's a great tenor player. I think he was one of the main house bands in the Tonight Show back in the 80s and 90s. So really great commercial sound, but also had the traditional edge. And he was coming from Dexter Gordon.
Ah, Dexter Gordon.
So if you imagine a guy, Dexter Gordon, playing at the peak of his career, the best solos that he ever came up with on various tunes, and then you imagine somebody who's taken those solos and corrected them, if you like, just ironed out any little niggles that might have been there, and that's where we come to and put a New York 80s sort of sound to it, and we got Ralph Moore. Right. So even though he's not a mainstream name, household name, or probably is actually in the States, he is somebody that's been influenced by a great.
Well, just on that point, I'm relating that point to guitarists. If you were to ask me for a list of top 10 guitarists, I might give you some obvious answers, but equally there are players that only guitarists know.
Yeah.
And not even all guitarists know them, but they have been very influential and are incredible. Alan Holdsworth, for example.
A local boy.
Not everybody as well, yes, for you, growing up in Leeds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he came from Bradford, didn't he? Or Ted Green. You wouldn't have heard of Ted Green.
No, you caught me.
No, well, he was something else. There's lots of... there's so many, really, but give me some more names of saxophone players. See if I've heard of them.
No, well, we'll go down some of the more mainstream. So obviously we've mentioned John Coltrane.
John Coltrane,
who just created or took a classical idea that was around in the 30s, I reckon, and developed a different approach to harmony in the jazz context. So he's obviously a great name. And then we have to say coming from the Charlie Parker school, Cannonball Adderley. Cannonball Adderley is still arguably my favourite alto player, even today, and he sounds so modern. You could put him next to anybody today, and you'd be like, oh, that was recorded not very long ago. That's what he did was he took Parker and he developed a technique that I feel was based on mainly Parker, but he had 10 years of experience to apply his own ideas onto it, and recording techniques got that much better in that time, and he just still sounds so fresh today.
Okay. So I've heard of him, but give me some more before we finish.
And then moving on, a modern approach is a very cool approach. Again, from the Parker School, we have Phil Woods. Phil Woods is supposed to have played the solo on the Billy Joel tune, Just the Way You Are. Really got a warm sound and just a much more cool approach. So it's just a sophisticated sound in alto sound. So spent many a time trying to transcribe some of his solos over the years. And then, who else do
Lester Young?
Lester Young, yeah. Precursor of Stan Getz.
You're right.
He reputedly taught Stan how to play. And I love Stan Getz. I absolutely adore him, and hopefully we can look at some of his solos on this course and maybe take a few ideas from him. I think
we should do some Stan Getz and Charlie Bird, shouldn't we?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that was the first jazz solo I learned at 16. Right. The Desafinado solo. I just sat down and back then I was just playing alto, so I tried to learn to play and it took a bit of time, I must say. It took a little bit of time.
A lot of key changes in that, isn't there?
That's when I realised that jazz wasn't just moving up and down the scales as fast as you can, which initially for me that's what it was. Just playing in one mode, one scale, and maybe altering the odd note here and there. But as you move through time, you can get used to hearing some of those different notes, and you can still play within the same tonal center. You can still start on the same note, but then you move up and down what we call a mode to get around the different chord changes, and that's one of the clever ideas that we want to.
Term 3, I think, eh?
Hopefully, we'll see how we go.
At some point in the future. Okay, I've just got one final thing I want to ask you, which is again about big bands and the 5 saxophones. By the way, we didn't give much of a shout out to the baritone guy. What's his job? I'll just ask you that quickly now. What does the baritone guy do?
The baritone has to do several jobs. In the soli that we mentioned, he has to play along with the tenors and the altos, some rather tricky lines. Sometimes he gets a little bit of a break.
He often doubles the lead, doesn't he? The lead alto.
He can do, but hopefully not on certain solis.
Yeah. Otherwise, it might be very solly.
Yes, indeed.
Very solly indeed.
And then he has to play along with the bass trombone or the trombone section. He might be playing in rhythmic unison with those guys. Then he also has to play with the rhythm section on occasion with the bass player. So he jumps about, does the baritone player, and you do need a baritone is very precise kind of approach. It's a very expensive instrument, first of all, and you do need the right equipment to play a bari well. And it's so we're hoping that we find a baritone player at some point. Have we got one?
At least one. It'd be nice. To get at least one bari coming along.
And it'd be, it's a fun instrument, and hopefully we can. It's all about the sound and the feel on bari, and we know that it's going to be hard to find somebody who enjoys playing baritone solely, but at the same time we just, fingers crossed, we'll get them doing some fun things.
Fingers crossed. Right. Final question to you today, Ed, is to do with doubling in the saxophone section. Is that an expectation that the saxophone players need to double on other woodwind instruments like flute or soprano sax or clarinet even? Or
it's a great thing to be able to double if we have some multi-instrumentalists, woodwind instrumentalists, and I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate their sounds.
Yeah, that's possibilities.
And it'll add to the texture of anything that we put together. And this is a work in progress as well. We want to adapt as time goes by and improve on things.
The longer you're with us, if you choose to join us and stay with us, the longer you're around, the more evolved things will become. I think it's fair to say.
But so it's not a requirement, but it would be a nice extra to have.
I think though, if players are at the earliest stages in their playing histories, that they're better just to focus on the saxophone, or do you think there's any merit in juggling, more than one instrument?
I think for when you're starting out and you just want to get started with jazz, definitely just stick to one instrument, and then see how it goes with that, and then you can branch out.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our little tete-a-tete for today. So thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Andy.
We'll see some more of you. We'll have another chat at some point, maybe.
Wonderful,
I
yes.
hope you found that interesting. If you're interested in the course, go to bandschool.com. You'll see the course mentioned on the menu, and complete the survey, and get in touch anytime if you've got any questions about the course. But we'd love to hear from you as soon as possible, because we're taking applications now with a view to the course starting later in the year. Okay, thank you very much. See you soon.